Welcome back to the Ask Judge Man series. Today we're going to be talking about activated effects of cards that are mandatory. My name is Benji and this is the Legacy Crusaders YouTube channel, and our goal is to help you misplay less and win more. If you have a question that wasn't answered in this video, make sure to leave it down in the comments below. Subscribe and click the notification bell to be aware of when our next video goes live. Your question could be answered in our next video, and quite often I will just reply to your comment if the question is simple enough or unrelated to our next topic. I left the following question as a poll on the community tab of the Legacy Crusaders YouTube channel. It reads as follows. You're under Droll Lockbird. You attack your opponent's field of monsters with Gabrion the Timelord. What will happen at the end of the battle phase? Fortunately, many of you actually chose the correct answer, which is that their monsters will be shuffled into the deck for no draw, but why is that the case? Droll Lockbird is a level 1 wind spellcaster with the following effect. If a card is added from the main deck to your opponent's hand, except during the draw phase, quick effect, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard. For the rest of the turns, cards cannot be added from either player's main deck to the hand. Gabrion the Time Lord is a level 10 water berry monster with the following effects. Cannot be special summoned from the deck. If you control no monsters, you can normal summon this card without tributing. It cannot be destroyed by battle or card effects. You take no battle damage from attacks involving this card. At the end of the battle phase, if this card battled, shuffle as many cards your opponent controls as possible into the deck or decks, then they draw cards equal to the number shuffled into their main deck. Once per turn during your standby phase, shuffle this card into the deck. A general rule of thumb in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that if you cannot resolve all parts of a card's effect, you cannot activate it. The exception is that of mandatory effects. Now, Gabrion the Time Lord's effect is mandatory. It does not say you can. You do not have the option to not activate his effect. Therefore, at the end of the battle phase, despite Droll Lockbird saying that they cannot draw cards because cards cannot be added to the hand, because that's what Droll Lockbird does, Gabrion's effect will activate. And if a card effect is activated, whether or not you can resolve all parts of the effects, you have to at least attempt to resolve as much of the effect as possible. So Gabrion's effect will shuffle all cards on their field into the correct player's decks, whether they have one of your cards that go into your deck. If it's just their cards, they just go into their deck, and at that point they cannot draw any cards. Gabrion the Time Lord is an interesting out to a lot of cards, especially if you've been Droll Lockbirded. If you want to know more about activated effects that aren't necessarily mandatory, you can click the link above. The general idea is if a card effect is mandatory, it will not give you the option that you can use this effect. It will either say when something happens or if something happens. Some sort of indicator of a trigger will be indicated on the card. I'm just briefly going to point out that there are some cards that appear to be mandatory but are not. Some are errata-related issues, such as Paleozoic trap cards, which were initially printed with text that was not clear that they were optional. It was implied that they were optional because they are trap effects, and trap effects in the graveyard are supposed to be implied to be optional and to be activated when you want them to. So the recent printing of the Paleozoic trap cards in the OTS packs have been updated to indicate this, although the most popular of them has not been reprinted this way, which was Paleozoic Olenoids. So if a mandatory effect is required to activate, what are the scenarios that you can use to prevent them from activating at all? The only way to prevent a mandatory effect from being able to be triggered is by having a card that prevents activated effects from occurring whatsoever, such as a card like Majesty's Fiend, or Outer Entity Azathoth being summoned into play, or even a card such as Inspector Border. I had a fun scenario come up once with Inspector Border. I had Saryuja Skull Dread along with a 5-counter Gamma Seal in a World Chalice deck. My board consisted of only Link monsters and a Gamma Seal, and my opponent normal summoned Inspector Border in front of my Saryuja's pointer. Now, Saryuja's effect is mandatory to give a monster 300 attack points. So that was the only monster effect I was allowed to activate that turn because I only controlled one type of monster on the field. If you'd like more details on how Inspector Border works, you can click in the iCard above. Another effect that would prevent a card from activating its effect, even if it was mandatory, is by activating a card that they cannot respond to, such as Super Polymerization. If a trigger effect that's mandatory that can activate in response to when a spell card is activated, it can't respond to the activation of Super Polymerization because this card says no cards can be activated in response to this card. Now, just the same as it is difficult to prevent mandatory effects from activating, it's also just as easy to force mandatory effects to activate. For example, if your opponent controls a monster, such as Doom Caliber Knight, a level 4 Dark Fiend type monster with the following effect, cannot be special summoned during either player's turn. If a monster effect is activated, tribute this card, negate the activation if you do destroy that monster. That card is required to activate whenever a monster effect is activated. So in the right scenario, you can force your opponent to activate one of their other monster effects, forcing them to negate their own monster effect with their own Doom Caliber Knight. So a simple way to do this particular scenario would be to attack into your opponent's Sangan, which would be required to trigger because Sangan's effect is also mandatory. An important note about mandatory effects is that they are also allowed to be activated during the damage step. If their trigger is met, they can be activated because they are mandatory and must. So I'm just going to quickly rapid fire go through a couple of scenarios where it might seem strange to activate a mandatory effect, but you have to activate them because there's no way around it. Your opponent controls Thunder Dragon Colossus, and you normal summon Cyber Dragon Core. Cyber Dragon Core is required to activate its mandatory effect to search a cybernetic card from your deck to your hand when it is normal summoned. You have normal summoned. it is mandatory, it will trigger, although it will resolve without effect because cards cannot be added to the hand. This could be problematic because Cyber Dragon Core also has an effect that activates in the graveyard, and you can only activate one of its effects per turn, so the fact that it was mandatory could be detrimental in this scenario. Lair of Darkness is mandatory to activate in the end phase to summon tokens to your field, or your opponent's field depending on whose turn it is, but if you activated Pot of Duality that turn, you cannot special summon. Although, because its effect is mandatory, it will trigger in the end phase, giving your opponent the opportunity to activate a card such as Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit. If you want to know more about Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, you can click the link up above. As you've seen on the thumbnail, I have the Atlantean Heavy Infantry in the thumbnail, and one of the reasons that card is there is because Atlanteans all have trigger effects that are mandatory when they are used to activate the effect of a water monster. So a recent errata changed the effect of Mermail Abysteus to be an optional effect. So you can activate Abysteus by discarding a water monster. This will allow you to special summon him. When he is summoned, he has an optional effect. And because mandatory effects have to be activated in chain before that as of optional effects, if you were to discard your Heavy Infantry to summon Abysteus, you will actually have to chain link 1 Atlantean Heavy Infantry to destroy a face-up card, which, despite whether or not your opponent has a monster, will have to activate because it is mandatory. Teus will then be chain link 2 if you wanted to add a Mermail to your hand. You don't have to, of course, because he is an optional effect, but that is something that people used to take advantage of prior to his errata, preventing your opponent from ashing him or striking him or some sort of card that might prevent him from searching the card, although a lot of those cards didn't exist back prior to this errata. Another scenario I can think of is if Teus's effect was mandatory and your opponent controlled a card such as Thunder King Ryo, you could activate the effects of Teus as Chainlink 1 to search and Heavy Infantry as Chainlink 2 to destroy the Thunder King Ryo, allowing you to successfully do the search despite that you would not be able to normally because you wouldn't have been able to trigger the effect if it was optional. So by his effect becoming optional, you became unable to use this scenario. If you want more information on Chainlink Order and SEGOC, which is simultaneous effects go on chain, you can click the link up above. Lastly, on a slightly unrelated matter, I'd like to discuss cards that have mandatory requirements for activating them, such as Oracle of Zephyra. This spell card has the following effect. When this card is activated, add 1 Zephyr monster from your deck to your hand. That's the only part of the effect that's relevant here. It's the only part I'm going to read. And that means that if you activate this card, you have to add a Zephyr card from your deck to your hand, because it doesn't say you can. It is mandatory aspect of this card, although activating a spell card is never a mandatory thing. You can never be forced to activate a spell card. It's just in this scenario, because you have to add a Zephyr card, you cannot resolve that if there are no Zephyr monsters in your deck. So this is a mandatory effect that cannot be activated of a card that is optional to activate. So this is a little different from actual mandatory effects, which is why this card was often played with cards such as Set Rotation, where you would give your opponent this card, preventing them from activating it. It would be set in their field spell zone, and they are allowed to set a card that they can't activate, but they can't activate it, so they can never get it out of their field spell zone, which was a pretty neat strategy. Currently, the next episode of Ask Judge Man is planned to cover the effects of cards that activate when they leave the field. If you want to know more about cards like that, or if you want to actually just change the episode, have a suggestion of your own, leave that in the comments below. But do note, you should explore the playlist of Ask Judge Man episodes because that episode may have already been created. And I'll see you next time.